Hi, it's been a second. So if you weren't aware, I have disappeared for the past 4 months. It was never really my intention, like, okay, on May 13th, I'm gonna delete everything. I'm just a Gemini, so I'm unpredictable, and I needed a break. I mean, clearly if I left, but I want to talk a little bit first about why I've been gone, where I was, what that reason was for that I disappeared, and then talk about all the things that I read while I was not posting, because we got quite a wrap up. So, where I went. The long story short is I deleted everything because I wanted to focus on job hunting. And I was really nervous that because I'd been showing off my YouTube as this marketable thing, which I think it is. I think saying on your resume, hey, I do videos, I know all this, I know the current trends, I know how to edit, you know, I have an audience. I think those are all really good things that I wanted to bolster and be like, hey, look at me. I had interviewed for my dream company and didn't get it. And not only did I not get it, I watched someone I know get it instead. I'm afraid to talk about that because I feel like people are gonna be like, oh, that's it. I know it doesn't sound like a huge deal, but I took a huge blow when that happened. And part of it was just because in general, job hunting is so draining in a way that no one prepares you for. It's every day being like, here's who I am, here's what I can do, here's how I'm marketable, here are my strengths, do you want to hire me? And it's just constantly, no, you're not good enough, you don't have these skills, even though you paid $100,000 for school, you don't have this and this and this. So it was so taxing already on my mental health, and then added on to that, I felt like I wasn't putting a good foot forward with YouTube, because in my vlogs, which is primarily what I would post, I would just be upset all the time. You would see me laying in bed for a week straight without showering because I was in that mental state of no one wants me. Overall, I just was feeling really negatively about my YouTube presence, and I felt so insecure that jobs were seeing that and being like, oh, she's lazy, or oh, she doesn't do this or this. One way or another, I was just not feeling like I was putting my best foot forward with my YouTube content. Just for me to be able to feel like I can apply to jobs and people aren't Googling me and the first thing they see is me sitting on the floor crying about not having a job, I did not like that that part of me was available online. So I wanted to take a step back from YouTube and just be me in person for a little bit. I knew I would come back. I'm sorry I was being cryptic with not really talking about it, but it's still hard for me to admit, like, I didn't get what I wanted. I could probably do a whole video just about job hunting in general. It's exhausting and it's heartbreaking. So long story short, I just needed space for me to be able to hype myself back up and like get out of bed and not broadcast that I'm not doing okay, which is something that I would typically do because I like to stay candid with people, but I think vlogging me being sad was perpetuating that, so I needed distance from it. And now I'm happy to announce I am employed. I signed on an apartment, so I'll be moving at the end of this month. I don't know when this video is going up, but at the end of September, I'll have my own place with my 2 kitties, and we're done with everything. Like, we're through it. We made it. That's the goal, or the outcome. What did I do in the meantime that I was gone? I joined a gym. I've been going to the gym.
I be up in the gym, just working on my fitness.
I joined Toontown, jokingly, and then ended up playing it for 3 months straight and getting to like level 106. If anyone wants to play Toontown with me, my username is Anna Soup. And I read just over 45 books. And that sounds impressive, but it was all graphic novels. I just wanted something fun and fast and light. And a lot of the books that I chose weren't good for me in that headspace that I was in, which I think is a good context to watch this video in. Is there's a lot of books, or not a lot, there's a couple books I didn't like, and that's entirely because I wasn't in the mindset to deal with like dark books about job loss and like all that stuff. I literally made an Excel spreadsheet about all the books I read. This is the job person I've become. And I just want to go through with you, talk about what I've been reading over the past few months. I'm going to call this like a summer wrap up. And this is going to be every single book other than like one book that I DNF'd that was for review that like is not even worth mentioning because it wasn't really my thing, and just talk about everything that I've read. So this is sort of my apology video. Sorry I disappeared. Thank you for coming back or staying here and just being supportive of me during literally the worst year. One of the worst years anyway. But yeah, we're back. We're better than ever. And here's the books that I read while I was gone. So the first book that I read after I disappeared off YouTube was actually a sequel. This is Fence Volume 2 by C.S. Picat, Joanna the Mad, and Joanna Lafuente. This is a graphic novel series about all these boys that are at this fencing school. The main character is Nicholas, and he is vying for a spot on this really prestigious team that has Seiji on it, who is like the national champion. This entire series is just them all sparring and trying to get onto that team. I wish there was a better synopsis for it, but there's not, because the biggest downfall about this is that it's just so short. Like, it only takes place in 24 hours and there's 2 volumes, and it feels like we haven't really gotten anywhere other than seeing their fencing matches. But despite that, it's still fast moving, it's still interesting. I like the characters. I don't know if this is going to be a male-male romance, but there's a lot of that camaraderie there. Obviously, they're like enemies to lovers. We'll see. So this is kind of difficult to review because on one hand, it's a little bit boring because we haven't really gotten to really any action yet, but also I'm not a huge fan of sports books or like sports romances, and yet this doesn't make me bored on behalf that it is about sports. Kind of this dualistic thing where it's not boring, but it is. But yeah, the art style is just easy to comprehend. Again, just the tensions are running high between the characters, so it makes it addicting. I gave this book 4 stars. I definitely want to continue the series. C.S. Picat in general, like, cancel me, but I love C.S. Picat. Her writing is awesome. I love her character building, so hopefully this series just picks up the pace. Other than that, I have no complaints. The next book I read I got from the library, which is going to be a huge theme, and my librarians hate me because I was on that request page every day being like, I want this graphic novel, I want this book. So I read a ton of books from my library. So the next book I read is called Moonstruck, Magic to Brew. This is volume 1 in a series. So this is a book about Julie, who is a werewolf, and as you can see in the background, a bunch of these characters are magical creatures. This is a magical world. The main character is Latina, and she works at a coffee shop. The gist of this book is that she and her girlfriend, it is a female-female romance, go to a magic show one night, and they bring their friend Chet, who is a non-binary centaur, I guess. And Chet ends up being the victim of having a spell be put upon them, and it's all about having to undo this and navigating the magical world and finding out what the cure for it is. I thought this book was so cute and fun. This book is one of those books that has the funniest banter. The characters are just so well connected with one another that it just really shines through, that their dialogue is so funny and cute and supportive. I love the setting of this. I love the magical feel of it. My favorite character by far was Chet. The best way I can describe their personality is Cusco from The Emperor's New Groove mixed with Kenji from Shatter Me. They are just so funny, so wholesome, so scatterbrained. I don't know. They were just incredible. I love that they were like a big part of this story. The only downside of this book was that it was a little bit difficult to comprehend because it is very magical, and so they're having to solve this magic spell, and not a lot of that was explained. So I feel like this book did a lot with the characters interacting with one another and like character development, but then as far as like solving this mystery type deal, it left you very in the dark. I gave it 4 stars. I'm highly interested in picking up the sequel, but my library said no. I do highly recommend this one. It's very inclusive, very fun, and I didn't hear anyone talk about this, so here I am talking about it. You should read it. Next, I read a manga series from the library that's called I Hear the Sunspot. It's by Yuki Fumino, and this is a series that is about these 2 college students. The main character is Taichi, who is just constantly hungry. He's very much an outgoing person, very loud, and one day he meets Kuhei. Kuhei is hard of hearing, and he needs an interpreter for class to take down his notes and to help him out with his assignments. So these 2 boys make an agreement so that Taichi will take Kuhei's notes and sort of be his interpreter in exchange for Kuhei bringing him food. It sounds very weird, but it is so wholesome and so funny. This is one of those books where the camaraderie between the characters is there's one super loud, outgoing, wholesome character with like a brooding, darker, troubled character. So this book was really cute, but it also had a really deep, meaningful part of the book because this book actually really delves into Kuhei being hard of hearing. It addresses topics like people romanticizing him for his disability, or thinking that because he has a disability, like they need to treat him a certain way or treat him differently, and he kind of ostracizes, or I guess isolates himself from other students just because he's had such negative experiences with the way people have treated him. And this series kind of explores how he's able to open up more around Taichi because Taichi treats him more like an equal, and he sort of almost becomes an advocate for not only Kuhei but hard of hearing people in general. And I've read 3 volumes involved in this series. The second one is called I Hear the Sunspot, Theory of Happiness, and then there's also something called Limit 1, which I don't know how mangas work. I don't know what limits are or if that means like spin-off series, but it's another continuation, and I think there's one more that I haven't read yet. I liked them all. I'm gonna say like the original 2 I gave 4 stars. They're my favorites. The third one talks about how the characters, I don't want to spoil it, but they kind of go separate ways a little bit just for life circumstances, and so you never really see them together much. And I feel like at that point in the book I want to see them together, and I want them to stop being angsty because, spoiler alert, this also sort of turns into a male-male romance. And it feels like it's a bit repetitive by book 3 that they're still experiencing the same type of angst that they were in book 1. So I'm kind of just like, all right, let's speed it up, let's do something, let's fix something. So even though it begins to meander a little bit and strays away from what I wish it would focus on, it's still such an impactful read. It's very sweet and I like it a lot. Again, I gave the first 2 4 stars, and then I gave the Limit 1 3 stars, and however many more there are, I would like to read them one day. I just don't have them at my library. Okie doke, and the next book I finished was Rhett and Link's Book of Mythicality by Rhett McLaughlin and Link Neal. If you recognize these 2 men, they are from the YouTube channel Good Mythical Morning, which I have loved since college when I discovered them. These 2 guys basically have a channel that's almost like an entire TV production where they talk about mythicality. And mythicality to them, and kind of the focus of this book, is being weird and being true to yourself and authentic without being ashamed of it. And so this book really dives into different topics like making friends, having parties. So just like different, I guess, practical skills, but it's also this exploration of Rhett and Link's personal lives and how they relate to mythicality and how they sort of became this brand and created this brand. It's really hard to explain if you don't watch their YouTube channel, but the best way I'm gonna explain this is sort of anecdotal stories combined with here's how you can be that energetic, unapologetic person. This is a mix of those stories and some activities, very colorful, and there's lots of pictures and multimedia stuff going on. I really wish I had read this on audiobook or listened to it on audiobook. I love Rhett and Link so much. I'm probably 99% sure they've narrated this audiobook. I can't help but feel like I would have liked it more as an audiobook, because as is, it was fun, but it takes a while to read because it's chapters about different things and it can be sort of tedious to read. I liked their backstory. I liked all the different infographics and the activities, but I just can't help but feel like I would have liked it more and I would have wanted to reach for it more often if it had been on audio and I could hear their inflection and their voices, almost like I was watching a video of theirs, which I enjoy so much. This wasn't bad by any means. You know, 4 months after the fact, I'm still I find it difficult to remember a specific piece of advice that I read from this, but I think if you like their YouTube channel, you should definitely consider picking this up because it gives you a lot of information and I think it really supports their message of being mythical and being weird and being okay with it. So I just love them. I'm so happy that I supported them. This was really fun. I gave it 3.5 stars. The next book I read is called Snotgirl. This is actually volume 2, so I read the sequel. This one's called California Screaming. This is a series about this LA fashion blogger named Lottie, and the whole premise of this series is that she has to maintain this image that she is polished and beautiful and everyone envies her life, but in reality she has allergies that make it so that her nose is running constantly, hence Snotgirl. She ends up being involved in this really crazy murder case, but it's so bizarre, so hyperbolic, it's almost unrealistic, and there's fantastical elements, and it's so difficult to describe. The art in this is my favorite art of any graphic novel. It is so colorful and so just like, when you think of like LA fashion and the whole vibe of this, it just fits it so perfectly. The best part of it are the characters because they're all so unlikable. They're all from LA. They're all just being skeevy and manipulative and they're awful, but it's so fun to read about. Kind of returning to what I said previously about this having like fantastical fantastical elements. I think that's the reason why this one was a little bit harder to grasp than the first book, because there is an element of like what's happening, and sometimes that's fun, like in the bizarre way. You're like, ooh, this is so weird, and other times you're like, we need an actual plot to be able to comprehend, to actually like connect with this and care about the characters. I gave it 4.5 stars because I just love how this book is so morally gray and is dealing with this really scandalous, really dark thing, but all you see is like the colors and the brightness, and like it's LA and it's glamorous. So I just think it's genius. The next book I'm gonna mention is actually a DNF, which if you're unaware, that means I did not finish it. And this might shock you that I didn't finish this book, because I typically really enjoy these authors, but Dating You, Hating You by Christina Lauren. I made it 144 pages into this book. I gave it a good shot. But when I tell you the synopsis, you'll kind of understand why I had to stop reading it. But this is a book about these two agents in Hollywood whose agencies merge, and so they're both now competing for job titles with their boss and with clients. So it's all about these two people in the workplace competing for a job. And that was too close to home, so I said no. I don't know if I'll ever be able to return to this without it hurting. But also reading this, it is so work heavy. And typically Christina Lauren romances are like romance heavy, but this one is just constantly them at their jobs and them dealing with customers, and it just wasn't fun to read. I was listening to this on audio because it was hard to get through, and I never do that with romance. So can someone tell me if this is an outlier from their other books, or if I'm just being sensitive? I don't like this book, and I feel like I'm gonna give it 2 stars if I finish it, but I don't know if it's just me or if the book itself is like not on the same level as her other books. I just wasn't having fun reading it, so I stopped reading it. Okie dokie, the next manga series that I read from the library, I actually got a copy of this for my birthday, so I have one. This is The Girl from the Other Side by Nagabe, which I think right now is a 6-volume series. I think I've read up to volume 4. This is one of my new favorite mangas of all time. This is a series that has a world that's divided from the outside and the inside. So the inside is basically the human population as normal, and the outside is the world that has been infested by these dark creatures that you can see right here. So it's the inside is trying to keep themselves safe from the outside. And this book follows this young girl who is on the outside for reasons that you discover as the books go on, and this creature that watches over her that she calls Teacher. And it is the most wholesome book in the entire world. This has my favorite art style of any manga. Let me see if I can get you a good page, because this book really details the scenery, which I feel like manga typically doesn't do. It just, I don't know what page I can use to communicate how beautifully this is drawn. From the interesting world building and the dynamics between like good versus evil and like this monstrous creature versus innocence, like I feel like I could write an essay about this book from an English degree point of view, but also it's just so fun and so cute. I've been sort of fluctuating my ratings of this book between 4 and 5 stars. I think some volumes are more confusing than others, but overall they have kept a very steady high rating, and it's this weird balance between this gruesome world versus this lighthearted and sweet storyline. I'm gonna sneeze. Yeah, I think I gave this first one 4.5 stars, but they're all leaning up toward 5 stars. They're just so great. Highly recommend. Like, that's a recommendation where it's like, don't even get it from your library, just buy it because you won't regret it. The next book I read is another graphic novel. I read Bloom by Kevin Panetta and Savannah Ganochow. This is a graphic novel that's sort of a coming of age story. It's YA. It's about Ari, who is 18. He wants to move away with his band, but his family owns a bakery and they need him for the summer, and there's this growing rift between his parents and him because he wants to go off and do his own thing. His parents need him. So to sort of compromise, he decides that he's going to hire and train another boy in his town who will fill his role so that he can go away at the end of the summer. And over the summer, as they are training together and working together, Hector and Ari just become closer, and Ari begins to question the conflicts with his friends and his family and come to terms with that and mature, as well as having like a blooming romance with Hector. First and foremost, I think the art style of this book is fabulous. It is all this blue art scheme. Like the title says, bloom. There's all these like metaphors for their relationship blooming. It's really precious. but I think this book is sort of cookie cutter. It just seemed so average to me, maybe because I've been reading YA for like 6 years now, but I was just never shocked by anything that occurred, and I don't necessarily read because I want to be shocked, but this book felt very monotone because it just seemed like generic plot points that I've read in any other YA contemporary story. That being said, I did like that it was set at a bakery. I did like how whenever Eyre was being sort of childish, he was called out by Hector. You get to see him shift throughout the book and grow up out of that. But like I said, it just felt very formulaic, and then by the end of the book I think it was rushed. That's not to say that it's not a good book. I think for sure if you enjoy any of the elements that I mentioned, this will fall into those categories and it will easily check those boxes. But I think I just wanted something a little unique, something that would take me by surprise or grab me by the heart, but this book just sort of fell under the category of it was pretty good. So I gave it 3.5 stars. The next book I read, I'm really upset that I don't have a copy of because I want a copy for my shelf eventually. I read Woman World by Aminder Dhaliwal. This is a book that's set in a world where all the men have died out, and it's not even one full story. It's all these little scenarios on every page. It's like little vignettes of things that happen in the world after that occurs, and it is so funny. This is one of those books where I'm like, why has no one talked about this? It is perfect. This book references memes. This book breaks the fourth wall. This book has genuinely made me laugh out loud, which is so difficult to do, especially in a graphic novel format. And I think the best part about it is just so inclusive as well. So in the book, there's lots of women that are naked, and so you get to see all different types of skin colors and body types. There's trans women. I just cannot say enough good things about this book. It was one of those books where like every page I took a picture of it to send to a friend because I was laughing so much and had to show someone else. I highly recommend it if you want a book that's gonna make you laugh but also make you think a little bit, and if you want to support women. The author's a woman of color. It's the best. It's the bee's knees. It's the bee's whole anatomy. It's so good. The next book that I read is called Brave Like Lily by Richard Cardenas. Richard is actually a YouTuber friend. I've known him since like 2013. I'll link his channel down below, and this is one of his many books. So this book is about a Mexican-American boy named Mateo. This 13-year-old's older sister was killed via police brutality. The police shot her unjustly. So this is Mateo's response to that and him having to work through his grief that really comes through via his anger. I think the conversation of police brutality is really relevant, and I liked how it was tackled from that angle of being in a Mexican-American community. The biggest thing that shone through in this book for me was that Mateo's anger was just very stark. His anger is so palpable and so touching. And this wasn't just primarily a book about police brutality, it also tackled a lot of subjects, like Mateo's gay, so it talks about him wanting relationships with other boys in his class. It also talks about family relationships and accountability. My only complaints about this book were that it reads really young, and I think part of that is because the writing style was very simplistic, but also because the story felt a little bit half-baked. It's quite short, and I feel like we could have taken a little bit longer to flesh out some of the events that were occurring and the emotions that he was experiencing. Obviously, it's like a heart-wrenching and a grieving story, so I wish that the length of it and the depth of it could have reflected that, and I feel like it could have just slowed down a bit to unpack it. Still, overall, I think it did handle a lot of great topics really mindfully in a way that I think packages it for a young reader really perfectly. So I did enjoy this book. I gave it 3 stars, and I would like a copy for my shelf one day. Okie dokie, the next book that I read, I don't know why I just transitioned to that happy tone because this is also a pretty sad book. I was sent a book by Fierce Reads for review, and this one's called The Other Side by Juan Pablo Villalobos. So this is actually a nonfiction book. The subtitle here says Stories of Central American Teen Refugees Who Dream of Crossing the Border. So this is actually a book that is inspired by this author going to different refugees in America or people who are currently in like border control camps and talking to them and finding out their stories. And this is all focused on teens who came to America from Central America. So it talks about their different experiences, why they came to America, how they're treated in America. It tackles like deportation and different struggles they're having in their home countries, really just to educate people about why these people are here and to humanize the backstories of the people who cross over. So I really enjoyed enjoyed this as an educational resource because I think it really specifically hones down on those particular people who come over. You can see it is very short. This is barely even 150 pages. Each individual story in here, I think there's 15, are only like 5 to 10 pages long, so it's a really brief read. So I enjoyed that, but also with it I feel like there came a lot of stunted development of, first of all, emotional reactions to things that were occurring, because this was a very just physical description of why they came, how they came, and there wasn't really any description of how they were feeling or any grief, and really just any details slipped through the cracks because it was so short. Part of me feels like I would have rather read one story about one of these refugees that's totally fleshed out and has that emotion and has those details rather than 15 shorter ones, but I feel like that also defeats the purpose of having a collection that shows a ton of diverse stories. So it's difficult. This is definitely a quick read and it's informative, which is why I enjoyed it and why I recommend it, but it's not something that's going to be lasting because it did lack that element that made my heart connect with it. So I give this book 3 stars. I enjoyed it for what it was. The next book I read was My Brother's Husband by Gengaro Tagame. This is a manga series, I think it's a duology, about a man in Japan named Yaichi. He lives with his daughter Kana. They live a very typical, easy life. And then one day, this man named Mike shows up at their doorstep, who he explains to be, this is difficult, Yaichi's twin brother who moved to America, or Canada? It's his husband. Yaichi's brother was killed in a car accident, and so Mike, his estranged husband, is coming to Japan to connect with his roots and his family, to discover what it was like for him growing up and just be closer to his home. So it's about how Yaichi takes in Mike. And this whole manga explores the theme of homophobia, especially within traditional Japan societies and neighborhoods, both from the perspective of an adult who is less accepting of that, and then the daughter who is younger and a lot more accepting because those ideals haven't really been instilled in her as deeply. So this is all about them learning more about Mike and being gay, and also at the same time a story about grief. I like the storyline of they were challenging their beliefs, or I guess at least Yaichi was. The daughter really didn't have anything that she needed to challenge. She was really accepting from the get-go. I gave this 3 stars, and the biggest reason for that is something that I haven't heard anyone else talk about it, so I don't know if it's like a me thing. So this author is also the author of a lot of like gay erotica manga, which I'm not at all shaming, like go for it. But the way that he draws the male characters, you can already tell they're very thick and burly. I began feeling uncomfortable with how these male characters were drawn in such stark contrast with there being a child in the book, which it's difficult to explain because I know like these men obviously aren't pedophiles. I'm not trying to imply that gay men are pedophiles. It was hinting that you're supposed to see these men as like muscly and powerful and big and sexual, and yet there's a child in the book that's a huge focus of the book, and they exist in such close proximity to one another. So one instance of many that I want to point out is like things like this, where as you can see he's like very muscly and she's like touching his chest for whatever reason, and then he gets mad and all this, but there's just so many scenes where like the little girl will like want to sleep with Mike just if she had a nightmare or something, but he's like in his underwear and he's super big and muscly, and I know people have those body types, but am I wrong in seeing that way, where I just felt so uncomfortable that this author is sexualizing these men while they're interacting with a young girl? It's more of an issue with the author and the drawing style than the characters, or what the characters are doing. I just was uncomfortable during it. It came off the wrong way to me. By all means, if these two characters are gonna have a developing romance, question mark, I don't know, go for it. But I hated how it was always these two characters were like sexualized next to a young girl. It was just weird to me. So that was the reason why I took off 2 stars. It was still a good read, like I said, because it challenged those norms, but made me uncomfy. So the next book I read was The Love and Lives of Ruksana Ali, which is by Sabina Khan. This is a YA contemporary book about a girl named Ruksana who is a lesbian. She's from a very conservative traditional Muslim family that's from Bangladesh. Ruksana lives a very secret life, trying to stay private from her parents. She has a girlfriend that her parents don't know about, until one day her mom finds them kissing, and so she is shipped off to Bangladesh to be in an arranged marriage. A lot of really dark, intense things happening in this book, and this is going to be one of those books that I mentioned earlier that I think if I would have read this at a different time I might have interpreted it differently, but it is what it is. First and foremost, I really liked this book because it talked about culture and it talked about having homophobic homophobic parents and the struggle that comes with that and having to hide yourself. I think the intersection of culture and being unaccepted is something that a lot of teens could relate to. I just really appreciated that it offered that perspective because I think it is something that's so relevant. But I would say that the theme of that is pretty much the only thing I really enjoyed from this book, because I had a big problem with just how cruel and homophobic this book was. There was intense, abusive, homophobic behavior that Ruksana had to deal with, to the point of like physical abuse. And obviously that's not fun to read, and I'm not saying I gave the book a low rating just because it was in the book, but I feel like it was given forgiveness so easily. Having to read that and knowing that conversion therapy happens to people and people are killed for being gay, like, it's a real thing and it's like hurtful. So for it to be forgiven so easily almost added to the hurt that this book caused, because I didn't like it. Ruksana deserved better than that. Take everything that I say with a grain of salt, because I'm not a woman of color and I don't really understand the culture of being so close with your family that you forgive your family and they're kind of this very tight-knit community for you. But I still felt like there was a lot of justice that Ruksana deserved, and being able to just forgive people so easily for putting her through a lot of literally torturous things, I didn't like it. I felt really sorry for her, and I didn't like that she was so forthcoming with forgiveness for terrible things that she went through. Also, one thing I did not like is that in order for her family to sort of change and be like, oh, maybe we should accept you, a gay person had to die for them to be like, oh, this might happen to you if we keep being unaccepting. So I just really didn't like how it had to kill a gay person just for the parents to have this revolutionary turnaround of, oh wait, now we love our daughter. Sorry if that was a spoiler, but I feel like it's a really important thing to mention because it's a book that's working toward normalizing gay people in other cultures, and yet to do that it killed a gay person. So it's difficult. Again, I'm trying to grapple between her coming to terms with her culture and me not being a part of that culture. Despite my personal issues with it, I also just didn't really like the writing style. I felt it was really weak. But yeah, I'm not gonna lie, my biggest gripe with this was just that I did not understand why characters were being given forgiveness when they didn't deserve it. So it was difficult to read, but at the end of the day it was an important read. But I just think the way the author handled it and excused the fact that she had gone through those dark things, I wasn't a fan of. Going from a 2-star book to a 5-star book, actually I think I gave it 4.5, but the more I think about it, the more it's 5. The Friend Zone by Abby Jimenez. This is an adult romance book following a main character named Kristen. She has uterine fibroids, which gives her constant chronic pain. It's a period issue, if you didn't know. It's uterus related, so she's always had trouble with her periods. It's always painful for her. She's constantly bloated. She's got like literal tumors in her uterus, so she's planning on having a hysterectomy just to correct that and to make sure she's not living a painful life. And then she meets Josh. She ends up falling a bit for Josh, but finds out as they get to know one another that he's a huge family man. He wants a bunch of kids, and the more they fall for each other, the more that she wants to hide that from him because she knows that she's getting this done. So it's just this really turmoil-ridden story about how they're falling for one another, but she's unable to have kids. She's gonna have this procedure that literally makes it impossible to have kids, but they're falling for one another. This book is equal parts hilarious and sassy and fun. This also had really sexy scenes, and one of the reasons why I love it is because the love interest knows that the main character has period problems, but doesn't know about the hysterectomy and the chronic illness. So he's automatically super understanding about periods and sex, and it's all so candid. And I feel like other romance books very easily glamorize relationships and sex, and they make it so perfect and so gleaming and so pretty. And this book just breaks down that barrier, and it talks about human things and like bodily functions, and I think that that made it so much more realistic and so much more enjoyable. I love how the main character's chronic pain was explored and the way that she has to deal with that, and also the love interest's support of her during that kind of ties into that candidness that I just talked about. It was so beautifully done, and I think the way that this explored that conversation, and I know that a lot of people would probably have an issue with how long it takes Kristen to actually talk to Josh about having the hysterectomy. I've seen a lot of people say that that's annoying to them, but for me, I felt like it was so angsty and it was so realistic for her to want to hold on to something that she really loved, their relationship. It's just so complex, even though it's a romance book, and there's so much emotion and so much heart to this that you wouldn't expect it to have, even though it does have the fun and sexy parts. So So I just loved it. I loved it. And as much as I want to say this was like the perfect book, I did have a couple minor issues with it. There are some distasteful jokes in here, and there's definitely some of that like you're not like other girls vibes, but the reason why that really didn't affect my reading experience a whole bunch is because it's not like a main drive of the book. It's just like a comment that they would make in their inner monologue every now and then. And then also I think a big issue that people who don't like this book have with it, and also I'm really not a fan of, is the ending of the book. Read it and we'll discuss. Ignoring those two parts of it, I just love this book. It made me laugh, it made me cry. As you can tell, I have sticky tabs galore. Just read it, okay? Just read it. The next book I read was Aisha at Last by Uzma Jalaluddin. This is a book that's a Pride and Prejudice retelling with Muslim characters. So it's a Canadian author, Canadian setting. The main character, Aisha, is a very much like a modern Muslim. I don't know if that's a good term for that, but versus the love interest of this book, Khalid, is a traditional Muslim. He wears the floor-length gowns and he has the head wrap and he doesn't shake hands with women. So all those different more traditional Muslim customs. And it's about how they get to know one another, again mirroring Pride and Prejudice, where there's judgments about one another. So it's all about how they end up having to work together and unravel those prejudices and that pride. It was just fascinating. There is like moments of Islamophobia by, for example, at Khalid's workplace, his boss is white and makes a lot of judgments on him because he, like the way he dresses and his different customs and what he eats and all that stuff. So I think that is really challenged, and I think that that's an interesting part of the book as well. My only issue with this, other than the fact that I wasn't the hugest Pride and Prejudice fan, so it was kind of difficult for me to like make those connections to what was what and where was where, is this book had a really difficult pacing. It was pretty dry, so it took a lot of effort for me to go back to it. It felt like a lot of the scenes were filler, and so I ended up having to skim to the places that I cared about. And so I think the last maybe 100 pages of this book, I just pick and chose what I wanted to read. I got what I wanted to know about, and then I continued on. So I gave that book 3 stars. I think you would enjoy it if you're familiar with Pride and Prejudice, and especially if you're interested in like an Islamic translation of it. The next book I read was another graphic novel from the library. This one was called Cucumber Quest: The Donut Kingdom by Gigi DG. So this is a kids middle grade, maybe young reader, graphic novel series about this main character named Cucumber. It's a very food-based world who has to go on this mission, and he's a very unlikely candidate for that. He has to go on a mission and defeat this evil queen who is collecting these powers that's gonna make her take over. It's all about how he goes to do that, and his sister Almond comes and intervenes and helps, and it challenges gender roles about men going on tasks and women staying home. It was very cute, very easy to read. The art style was adorable, but it was just so tropey and predictable and young, which I know is a dumb criticism to make because here I am, a 22-year-old woman reading a book for 10-year-olds, but I feel like there's a distinction between books that are interesting for young readers that still surprise you as an adult versus books for young readers that just play into the very typical roles. And that book definitely was more typical than interesting. So it was quick, it was cute. I'm just not going to read any of the sequels, so this is a short review. The next book I read was Satoko and Nada by Yupachika. This is a second volume to a series that I read previously this year, and this is all about these 2 girls. One of them is from Saudi Arabia and one of them is from Japan, and they both are roommates in America going to college. Sort of like Woman World, they're not one complete story, but they have 4-panel little humorous vignettes of their life in America, and it talks about their different cultures and how it differs from America and from one another. It's very informative about her Muslim culture and the differences in America and the misconceptions that people have about it. So I guess it's almost like this educational resource for, I guess, Japan that doesn't have a huge Muslim presence. But these books are just so cute and so fun. Nada is definitely the sassy one, sarcastic one. Satoko is very shy and quiet, and they really bond together well and become a team and a pair. So I just love how this is a mix of both being informative and funny. I did enjoy volume 1 a little bit more than this one, but I still cannot wait to continue the series. I think they're just so much fun. They offer so much information. Then I read a couple more graphic novels from the library. The first one was Spinning by Tilly Walden. This is Tilly Walden's memoir, and it's all about how she was a figure skater when she was younger who was also coming to terms with her sexuality, being a lesbian. I liked the art style of this. It was all in purples and very melancholy, which is something I love. Leave your melancholy book recommendations down below. I would love them. But I just felt like this story was a bit monotone, a bit flat. I feel like I was just looking for the purpose of it. Like at least there would be some sort of not character growth, but like coming of age story, or she would have this realization about herself. There was just nothing about it that made me connect with it a ton. Even though I do like stories about girls coming to terms with their feelings, liking other girls, even that I felt like was very underexplored and I didn't really snap with it. I gave it 3 stars. It wasn't my favorite, but I am so impressed with Tilly Walden because if you don't know, she's my age and she has like 7 graphic novels published. Like what? Then I read a manga called Our Dreams at Dusk. This is by Yuki Kamatani. This is a graphic novel that interested me by the synopsis, but the synopsis explained more than the actual book does. So according to the synopsis, this is about a boy named Tasuku who is struggling with his sexuality. He knows he's gay, and so he's struggling finding people to relate to. And one day he comes across this magical woman who introduces him to a whole group of people who identify somewhere on the LGBT spectrum, and so he finds this safe space with them. And there's really no plot other than that. I guess it's sweet that he was able to meet people, but I was so confused by this book most of the time because there's magical elements to it, like I mentioned, that really aren't explained. The whole book just seemed to be rushed. We didn't really get to even know the main character very well, so it felt like we were learning more about the people he was talking to than the actual main character himself. I think this is one of those books where you have to read on to understand more, but I'm just not interested in reading on. I gave this book 2 stars. I see what it was trying to do, but I feel like maybe the translation of this was off or it just needed to be a little bit longer. Then I read, I don't want to say a picture book, but definitely a very short, let's just say picture book, Sea Prayer by Halit Hassani. So this is a book that's in the form of a letter from a father to a son. It is about refugees inspired by Syria having to cross the sea or the ocean to get to a safe place. And it's about this father worrying for his son's safety after there's been so many tragedies about kids not making it over, and how that's so unfair. I'm gonna like cry. I'm getting goosebumps. That book was so good. This book is like 30 pages long. Again, it's like this picture book basically. And Halit Hassani just has this perfect style where it's powerful and haunting, and especially in this book because it's so short and it's in that format from father to son. It's heart-wrenching. It's just gut-turning. It was brilliant and gorgeous. I get chills thinking about it. It's spectacular. I highly recommend getting a copy for yourself. Pick it up from the library, buy a copy, just walk into a Barnes & Noble and read it in 2 minutes. Beautiful book. Then I read another graphic novel from the library. This one was Honor Girl by Maggie Thrash. I lied. Graphic memoir. Novel does not mean book. It means fictional story. So this is a graphic memoir about Maggie also coming to terms with her sexuality as a girl who likes other girls. I don't remember if she's a lesbian or bi or pan, so that's why I'm saying girls attracted to girls. But this is set at a summer camp, so it's all about how she goes off to summer camp and sort of falls for one of her camp counselors, the conflict behind that and how they couldn't really be a thing, and so she really carried that with her for a while. And it's all about coming to terms with sexuality, but also that confusion doesn't always lead to closure. My camera died, so I went to PetSmart while I waited for it to charge. Could I just buy an extra battery to prevent having to do things like that? Yes. Anyway, I was in the middle of talking about Honor Girl by Maggie Thrash, but I have more negative things to say about this than positive. Mainly, I felt like this book was too long for what it was. It just seemed like it was dragged out, not necessarily in a way that like explored the characters or furthered the plot. It just gave us a lot of menial scenes that didn't really apply to the actual narrative of the book. They were just filler almost. The biggest thing that I can't get over, and this is a mean criticism, but it's like, it's my truth. I'm speaking my truth. The art style is ugly. It's written in colored pencil, and I'm not trying to be rude, but it just looks like art that a 6th grader would do. It's very basic, rudimentary almost. It's just so stick figure-like. I wasn't a fan of the art style whatsoever. I felt like it was too long and it dragged. In graphic novels, it's very difficult for graphic novels to drag, so that was a problem. So more often than not, I was just bored and confused than actually enjoying the book. So I gave it 3 stars. The next book I read is one of my favorites of the year. I read The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. This is a book in verse, meaning like in poetry format, about this young woman named Xiomara who comes from a really conservative Catholic family. She's Dominican. She's had a lot of experiences that have shaped the way that she grew up, and she really wants to use her voice through poetry to express some of the feelings she has about adhering to her mom's strict form of religion and the way they try and control her and the way that she has been body shamed throughout her life, and a plethora of other issues that she just wants to express through poetry. And my favorite thing about this book is that you can really get the sense that she's a poet from the actual style of the book itself, because it's in that poetry format. So I think it speaks really true to what Xiomara is doing and saying and dreaming of being. I loved this book. This is what books in verse should consider the god tier. Like, this is what you are striving to be. This book is gorgeously written. So many of the lines are so memorable and beautifully written. Again, a storyline that I really like is girls who grow up from religious families and then they question that, and this definitely involves that, and I think that is always just so morally complex and relatable to me. So I liked seeing the way that Xiomara figured through that and the way that her feelings came through in her poetry. The beginning and the end of this was my favorite because there's such a sharp dialogue about what she experiences, and when it gets to those climactic points, she is really on top of her word choice and it's really hard hitting. But the middle of this I felt like lagged a little bit. I don't want to contradict myself in saying this, because although the middle did lag a little bit, this book has some of the most incredible character building for a book that's so short. So I think the middle of it, even though I felt like plot wise it really wasn't doing that much, you really get a sense of the characters and you get to deeply understand her family and her friend group. So I think because this book was able to pack that much character development into obviously such, it's not a short novel, but there's very few words on every page, it's incredible. Honestly, I feel like this book should be required reading. It tackles so many great subjects that I think a lot of teens relate to, and even me. I just can't say enough good things about this book. It was beautiful and had the best message, and everyone read it, okay? That's just it. The next book I read was King of Scars by Leigh Bardugo. So this is a series that follows one character from the original Grisha trilogy, Nikolai, and a character from the Six of Crows duology, Nina. And it's about their two perspectives, how they're doing after their respective series, what sorts of shenanigans they've gotten themselves into, and it ends with a plot twist. So obviously Leigh Bardugo writing style, we love her. We love to see it. It's so great. The characters are sassy and witty in that really characteristic way that the Grisha characters are. I love Nina and I love Nikolai. My thing with them though, and the reason why part of this book just grated on me, is I could never get over the feeling that I was reading a book about side characters, because these two characters are side characters in the series they exist in, and like arguably Nina is one of 6 main characters, but she wasn't in my top favorites of those characters, so it was difficult for me to place them in the context of having their own storyline, especially because not a lot happens. And I'm just gonna say it, Nina didn't need a perspective. Most of the action happened in Nikolai's point of view. I feel like Leigh put her in there because people cared about Six of Crows, cough cough, a little bit more than the Grisha trilogy. I just don't see her relevance to the storyline. Maybe in the future the storylines between Nikolai and Nina will connect, because in this book they're like separate avenues and I couldn't figure out why we were focusing on 2 completely different things in one book. So yeah, this never really was boring, but it felt like not a lot happened. And like I said, the 2 storylines never converged, and it feels like Leigh Bardugo is one of those authors that weaves threads and has like masterful storytelling, and yet these 2 parts felt so disconnected. So I'm still grappling with what that means. Maybe in the second book things will be clearer on that. I'm definitely gonna read the second book based on how this one ends. I gave this one 4 stars, like I said. Didn't hate it, not super memorable, but I do like the characters. Then I read a book from the library called Fix Her Up by Tessa Bailey. This is an adult romance about this woman named Georgie who has a degree, but she decided that she wants to have fun and started her own business that's like a clown service for birthday parties and stuff. So she's a clown. Her family does not approve, and so in order to make her parents take her more seriously, she decides to fake a relationship with Travis, who is an ex-Major League Baseball player, and at the same time that she wants him for a fake relationship to like boost her own image, he also is trying to get a radio job after being branded this very player-ish type of guy who's gotten into lots of scandals. So he also wants to have a better image and decides to reciprocate this fake dating so that this radio station will see him as like a family man who has a girlfriend now, and he's so tame now. Like he wouldn't give us a bad image for working here. So it's like this fake dating trope, and then obviously it's a romance book, so like feelings develop. I hated this book. The writing was so cringy. It was so bad. There were so many metaphors that didn't make sense, and like, especially during sex scenes, they would say things to each other that I was just like, bleh. I'm not a big fan of the fake dating trope in general. I just realized my cat's food bowl is up here. Do y'all want this? Are you hungry? The way that the guy acts in this book, I'm a really big stickler for like, I want it to be healthy and consensual and nice. This was not it. So this love interest Travis, I don't like him. He was the type of guy where he was like, I don't want to be with her because she's like a sister to me, but then he would still sexualize her, and it was the type of thing where like, he didn't want to be with her, but he didn't want anyone else to be with her. And I remember at one point, she like hires a guy to come fix her fireplace, and he busts in there like, no, I'm going to fix it. Like the caveman of the tribe had to have his control over her. And then there's like a scene where he was thinking about her being with other men, and he's like, it makes me so uncomfortable. Even knowing she has a vibrator makes me uncomfortable. I'm like, dude, that's an inanimate object. Are you good, fam? And then because he considers her a sister, there's lines that are so cringy about like how he considers her a sister, but he still considers her sexy. So literally there's a scene where like she falls over him or something, and he reaches out to grab her and accidentally grabs her boob, and he literally says, I get a handful of little sister tit. Please cite your source where that's okay. So like writing style wise, love interest wise, it was just not acceptable to me. Also, Georgie is just like, when I say literally a clown, she's literally a clown. She was childish and dumb. I remember specifically there was this one scene where someone catcalled her. She was just oblivious. Like obviously it was someone being like, hey girl, how's it going? And she was like, hee hee, it's going good, and like was talking back to him as if like not knowing it was a catcaller. And then that of course presented a situation where then Travis could step in and be like, ha ha ha, my woman, get out of here. I just didn't feel like it was, I'm just gonna say it, good. It wasn't good. The sex was so dumb and cringeworthy. They like had public sex at a baseball field from a high school, which is like, please arrest them, FBI. And it was so badly written too. Like Travis would always call her baby girl, which does not help the fact that he was sexualizing her as like a younger sister type figure. I just don't vibe with this book whatsoever. In my spreadsheet I literally put 0 stars because I just did not have a fun time reading it whatsoever. I literally felt like I was reading a book from 2011, not 2019. It was bad. Do not recommend. And then I read another graphic novel. This one is Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me by Rosemary Valero O'Connell and Mariko Tamaki. This one was a gift too. This one is from, uh-oh, doesn't have a name. If you sent this to me, thank you, because this is one of my favorites of the year. This graphic novel is about this young girl in high school named Freddie, this one back here with the black hair, who's in a relationship with Laura Dean, who is another girl who goes to her school that doesn't treat her well. She's constantly cheating on her, and they break up and they apologize and get back together, and Laura Dean is just manipulative with her emotions and takes advantage of Freddie because she's young and she likes her and she wants to keep this going because Laura Dean is popular and she's everything that she wants, and so she keeps going back to her every time that they have a fallout. Hence the title. And this book just follows her growth and the way that she evolves with her friend group after they witness her continually going back to this bad relationship, and the way that she grows from this and realizes her worth over the months. Wow. This book is amazing. I gave this book a full 5 stars. I can't recommend it enough, even though I know it sort of has mixed reviews. For me, I loved this book because, first of all, I think it's my new favorite art style from any graphic novel ever. From a storytelling perspective, I really liked the progression of Freddie realizing her worth. I think a lot of people dislike this book because they think that it's not a good representation of relationships and the main character is juvenile and doesn't make good choices, but I think the part that I like the most about this is because it is unlikable characters and they do make bad choices and they then have to suffer the consequences of making bad choices. Definitely give this one a try. Next, I read another graphic novel from my library. This one was called Bingo Love and the authors are T. Franklin, Jen St. Ange, Joy San, and Cardinal Ray. This is a graphic novel all about these 2 black women that fall in love in the 1960s, and then it's a generational novel that follows after they were broken up by societal norms in their family. They meet again years later and reconnect. My favorite thing about this graphic novel was obviously the story of it and the content. 2 women of color falling in love in a time that wasn't really accepted yet. I felt like it was such an impactful story. I also like the fact that it took place over multiple years and you see them at 2 different points in their lives and you get to compare how they were as young people and as adults. However, I just wish that this book was longer and it unpacked a little bit more of that because it is taking place over so many years. I felt like it really rushed their story and their relationship and that development to the point where it felt like insta-love. Sometimes it would be talking about a scene that happened in the book or like a certain time of the characters' lives and there'd be this story happening and a story happening and then it stops and there's like a little bubble off to the side like, if you would like to learn more about this, read this other book. So it would like self-promo for you to continue reading in a different book, and I've never read that in a graphic novel before, and I don't know if that's a genius marketing technique or to me it just felt kind of like a scam. Like, I'm here to read this book, like why don't you give us the whole story in this book instead of making us buy like e-novellas of these spin-off stories. I felt like that was kind of cheap and it took away from me like comprehending the full story because I read this from the library, like I didn't have the access to go and read those immediately, so that really put a bummer on it. And my final thing that I just didn't really love about this was the ending of it. It's almost an exact replica of The Notebook. The ending reminded me so much of The Notebook that I can't get that comparison out of my head to the point where it almost feels like plagiarism. And I know that a story about women of color is highly different from like this male-female white romance that we've been reading and watching for years, but still I wish that even if it was close to how The Notebook is, like I wish it would have been a little more inventive with how that finished, but I just wasn't a fan of the ending, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So I gave that book 3 stars, but I still highly recommend it if you're looking for a book that talks about women of color and female-female relationships. It was very touching. And then I read an arc of Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky, which is Stephen Chbosky's sophomore novel that is an entirely different route from Perks Being a Wallflower. This is a 700-page behemoth fantastical horror book. The book follows Kate and her son Christopher, who move away from an abusive father, and in this new town Christopher disappears for 6 days into the woods behind their house and comes back with this really strange voice in his head and this urge to build a treehouse, otherwise his town will be in peril. And so it follows like, what is this voice, what was that forest that he can't remember those 6 days of, what are these forces that are telling him to do things, just in general, like what's the deal with this town. This book wasn't strictly bad. Like, of course it's Stephen Chbosky, he's an excellent writer, he develops things really well, he's able to weave threads through, but this book, like I said, is 700 pages and it was a lot. This book would make a great TV show or a great movie, but as a book it just threw way too much at you to the point where I really only enjoyed like 300 pages of it and the rest I skimmed, and it was trying to do way too much at one time. It was exhausting and it was way too much information and there was way too much happening. It just didn't work for me. So I give this book 2 stars. If it was 300 pages shorter I might have enjoyed it more, or if it was just a TV show I think I would have loved it a lot because it could really unpack some of that and make it more interesting and digestible, but I was not a fan. I thought because it was Stephen Chbosky anything he wrote I would like, but no. The next book I read was a graphic novel called Mooncakes. Actually, I don't think it's even out yet, so I read an early copy of this. This is a graphic novel that follows two characters. One of them is a witch and one of them is a werewolf. They were friends as kids, and then the werewolf, I forgot their names and my internet went out, so I like can't look it up. The werewolf character had to move away and comes back. They reunite a friendship. They sort of have a budding relationship, and it's all about how this town has these spiritual forces and these witches that are posing danger on them, so they have to sort of be the ones to step up and protect their town. This book has the best cozy fall vibe. If you need a book to read in October, you better pre-order this one because it is going to deliver on that front 1000%. It is such an autumnal book with witches and libraries and magical creatures and ghosts. I loved the art. Also, this book has a ton of representation packed into it. So the main character lives with her grandmothers, two women in a relationship. The main character is also hard of hearing and she wears hearing aids, which is very normalized. Also, her love interest is non-binary. They go by they pronouns. But what I didn't love about this book was I just felt that the plot was very formulaic. It felt predictable with no plot twists, almost like it was a middle grade book just because it seemed so elementary in the way that things would occur and the progression of the plot. I just wasn't really a fan of it. I also feel like the relationship and the romance in it was a little bit undercooked, and I would have liked to see a little bit more development of that throughout the story, but I still enjoyed my time reading it. I read an unfinished copy, so I'm sure that the finished copy is going to be stunning. I would still like to have a copy of it for my shelf because, like I said, the art style and the story of it was really fun. So I gave it 3 stars. I would recommend it for October if you're looking for a cozy fall read, and it was just really different and really inventive. The next book I read was also an arc of a graphic novel. This one was the Tea Dragon Festival, which is a companion book to the very beloved The Tea Dragon Society, which is all by Katie O'Neill, who honestly deserves the Pulitzer at this point for graphic novels. I know I said Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me was my favorite art style, but this rivals it. Katie O'Neill has the most stunning art, the most inclusive worlds. I honestly can't give you a great summary of this book because once again my internet went out, so I can't see Goodreads, but the Tea Dragon Society is set in these mythical worlds where there are dragons, and the population of people are always full of people of color, full of people of different genders and sexualities. In the Tea Dragon Festival, it's all about this dragon who has been asleep for centuries, who is supposed to watch over the town or have some involvement with the people of the town, and then ended up falling asleep because of nefarious means. And so whenever they wake up, they're feeling really inadequate and feeling really guilty, and it's all about the story of acceptance and making friends again. And what you should know is that it's a middle grade story that's just about community, and the whole book has so much representation in it. Like, the town speaks sign language, so there's this whole speech bubble system for whenever characters are signing. It's just so cute and positive and inclusive. Every single child should read these, or even adults too. This is one of those really great books where even though it's for kids and it's great for kids, as an adult it also really stuck with me and had a lot of powerful quotes. It was beautiful. The art, the message of it, and the way it spoke to me, even though I'm like probably a decade older than the intended audience. I gave it a full 5 stars. I definitely want to get a copy of it for my shelf when it comes out. Hopefully it's the same size as this massive one, and I can't recommend these books enough, or really anything by Katie O'Neill, because she is a goddess on earth. The next book I read is A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Bridget Kammerer, which is a fantasy book that is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. This is about a young woman named Harper who has cerebral palsy, and she one night gets dragged into a fantasy world on accident, and it turns out it's this kingdom with this prince who has this curse on him, so that if he doesn't fall in love with a woman in, I think it's like a season, so 3 months, then he turns into a beast and basically wreaks havoc on his town, and he only has like one more try until he's permanently like that, or something along the lines of it's like his last try. And so she has to work with him and his last living advisor to be able to solve this problem and care for the people left in his kingdom and sort of regenerate their hope and their trust in this kingdom that has basically been killed, and they don't really know what's happening. So it's this enchanting and angsty and enemies to lovers story about this young woman with a disability who goes into this world that is so different than her own. She's from DC, so really having to navigate a new political system and adapt to being in an alternate universe and solve their problems, because she just has this huge heart that's so giving and willing to help, even though she's quite literally dragged into this situation. I was just glued onto this story. At the time that I read this, I was not really enjoying reading that much. It was hard to get into books, but I read 200 pages of this in one sitting. It was just so addicting. I love how strong Harper was. I liked how broody and pessimistic, I guess, the male characters were in this. I just really liked the vibe between all the characters in the kingdom. But one thing that I was a major fan of with this kingdom is that because it was set as a parallel universe to our real world, so it was like real world, fantasy world, I'm not a huge fan of that. I think it's entirely because it reminds me of the movie Enchanted, where it's just, there's this silly undertone to it that I can't get over to make it seem like it's a serious problem. Whenever Harper would talk about her hometown, like America and Washington DC, and the fantasy characters would react to that, it just felt so out of place, and it made me feel like I don't like juggling between the two worlds. I want to stick with one or the other, or have it be like a urban fantasy, I guess. That part of the story just felt silly to me, and it just took me out of the story a bit to be reading those elements. The only other thing that I wasn't a huge fan of in this book was I feel like the characters' developing relationship was a little bit hidden beneath all the political strife. So I understand that after all this exposure to one another, it's very expected that they would eventually be drawn to one another, but I felt like I got a sense of their relationship not because it was written in the book, but just because it felt like it would be an eventuality. I like wanted them to be together, but it didn't really explore their emotional connection to one another as much as I would have liked it to. It's just a really beautiful book. I loved the representation, and I gave this one 4 stars. Next, I read another graphic novel from the library. This one was called Taproot by Keezy Young. This is a story about this young florist. His name's Hamal, and he can see ghosts. And this is a book that's sort of like there's a spirit world and there's the real world, and Hamal is this liaison between the two. And Hamal is the person there that has a foot in both worlds, so he can help out. So I love that this book was more paranormal than contemporary. I felt like that gave it a really cool spin, but the contemporary elements that were there were really, really cool. Like the town he lives in was so cozy. The fact that he works at a flower shop was really, really sweet. I loved that this male-male relationship, the way it bloomed, it was so tentative and so sweet and wholesome, and I really, really liked that. Even though I wish it could have been drawn out a little bit more, it was really well done. I just wish that we could have had a couple more of those sweet bonding moments. I gave this book 3.75 stars. Again, I feel like I just wish it would have slowed down and done a little bit more. I can't really mention why I had an issue with the ending of it because it would spoil it, but I just wish that we got more at the end, and maybe it could have been like a 2-part book where here's the first part of this book where they're solving this ghost mystery, and then the second part of the book that's a spoiler. But I wish that they could have focused on a little more, so I think it just stopped at a point where I wish there could have been more past that. So moving onward, the next book I read, we have a new favorite, is Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson, which is the most iconic book to grace YA, and also the most surprising book I've ever read all year. So this book is about a woman named Elizabeth who is an apprentice at a library, but these libraries in this fantasy world are magical libraries. So all the books there have power, and like they can move and trick people. So they're basically like keeping these books under control. She's lived there for her entire life because she's an orphan and she was sort of dumped there. And so she's been living really sheltered in this rural town and ends up getting caught up in a, I don't want to say scandal, it's like this tragedy, I don't want to spoil it, and has to go to the capital city to be under investigation for things that she was involved with. So it's kind of like her coming out of her naivety, being stuck in this one library, to being exposed to the sorcerers that are the people who would wield these magical books that she'd never met before, or she was kind of trained to fear. So it's all about how she's like basically being housed and transported by a sorcerer. So she's in close quarters with someone that she had always been trained to be wary of, and they realize they need to actually like solve what happened that she was involved in. Anyway, it's so good. So it's like this enemies to lovers story between Elizabeth and Nathaniel, who is the sorcerer I mentioned. This book is like a blend of Cassandra Clare, J.K. Rowling, and Sarah J. Maas, but like it did it better than all 3 of them combined. It's got like the demon-y vibes of a Cassandra Clare book. It has the romance and the sorcery of a Sarah J. Maas novel, and it's got like the magical library themes of a Harry Potter book. So it just blends everything that we love, and it put it all in one book, and it was done so well. One of my favorite things about this book is that the main character has panic attacks, so I love the representation in this book, and also the love interest is confirmed bisexual or pansexual Either way, like, that's bonkers and I was crying. I love it so much. I really have no complaints about this book, which is so rare for me. The only thing that I wish were done better, not necessarily something that like is a negative thing, I just wish the villain in this book were a little bit less black and white. I wish there was more nuance to why he's evil and why he was doing the things he was doing, because you learn very early on like who was behind a bunch of nefarious actions, and there's really no like misleading things about him. It's just very much what you see is what you get, and then we just have to defeat it and it's gone. And I wish that for a fantasy book that's so intricate in its world building, we could have had just as equally intricate of a villain. So if anything, that's my only complaint. Okay, the next book I read is another graphic novel from my library called Space Boy. This one's by Stephen McCraney. This is a book that has a very misleading title because it's not about a space boy. It's about this girl named Amy who lives in her parents' work on a planet in outer space, but her father ends up getting fired from his job, so they have to go to Earth, and she has to reaccommodate herself to living on this planet to living on Earth. And so it's all about this internal journey where she's in a new place. There's a bunch of new technology. It's very different. They have gravity here. But while she's at this school on Earth trying to reacclimate, she notices this boy. We don't learn his name in this volume, but there's this very mysterious boy, which is why I'm assuming it's called Space Boy, and she's drawn to him because he's so isolated and solitary. The writing style of this book was so gorgeous. I find it difficult to latch onto sci-fi concepts and to like understand sci-fi, but this book made it really accessible and easy. So the plot of it was really easy to understand, and I think it really took a backseat to the emotional journey the character was going through, which I think was interesting because it is such like a space themed story that it was actually quite introspective. And my only problem with it really was because it's called Space Boy and because she has this fascination with this boy in her school, we don't really get to see a lot of that. And I think I just felt that was the one hole in the story where I was like, why is this significant enough to be the title of it? And I think you'll definitely have to read on to learn that. But as is, I still think the book was worth 4.5 stars. I just wish we had gotten that little bit more that like connected all of those dots. I'm certainly interested in reading on if my new library that I'm going to after I move has them. If not, we go harass them to buy them. But I loved this book. It was very sweet and beautifully drawn and written, so I highly recommend it. I feel like this video has been jumping back and forth a lot with books I hated, books I loved, but now we're back to a book I hated. I took like 6 months to read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte because I wanted to feel accomplished that I read a classic, and this is one that so many people rave about and they talk about how strong of a character Jane is, and I just regret that I spent so much time on it because I ended up not liking it that much. So if you're unaware, this book follows Jane Eyre. The book starts out when she's young and she goes to the school for insubordinate girls because she's very outspoken. She talks back. It's really not acceptable at her time for her to be as confident and loud and opinionated as she is, and that's kind of a recurring theme where she encounters conflict with people because she's not afraid of being upfront and abrasive, even though it's definitely not standard for women at her time. So this follows her life as she grows up, and then she meets the famed Mr. Rochester and is like a teacher slash maid at his house. And I can't even describe what their relationship is supposed to be. I just didn't like this book. It was beautiful at some points, and I think if it were just a children's book about her when she was a kid going off to the school, sort of like a Madeline-esque story about like a boarding school and her experiences there and like being this outspoken kid, I think it'd be interesting. But whenever it transitioned to her adult life, I really just was not a fan of how long-winded it was and how there were such like abusive undertones between her and Mr. Rochester, and there were lots of comments that were just racist. I think I would have needed to read this for a class in order to really understand it and be able to justify those things. I don't know if I was just reading into it in a different context that made it so problematic, or if it actually just is not good. This just made me uncomfortable. It's like not even a good love story, so I just don't really understand what it was trying to do, even though it was beautiful and there were lots of quotes. I just either was bored or was horrified by what I was reading. So again, really the only part of it that I liked was maybe like the first 200 pages, but the ending of it definitely dragged it down. I only gave this 2 stars. Someone send me a SparkNotes link or something. Maybe I misunderstood. Next, I read Technically You Started It by Lana Wood Johnson. I got this from the library. It's a YA contemporary book that's entirely told through text messages, so if you open the book it's just like speech bubbles the entire book. The main character, who I cannot remember her name, and once again my internet's out so I can't can't look it up. She is texted by this boy in her class named Michael. The whole thing is there are two characters with the exact same name. The first time he texts her, he's like, hey, it's me from your history class. And she's like, which Michael? And then he says, the fun one. So the whole premise of the book is that there's two people with the same exact name because they're like cousins or something, so it's acceptable. So the whole book is like them getting closer, them just talking about their lives, and like they start to talk more and more through text message, and she thinks it's this one guy and you don't know which person it is. This book had a good idea. I don't have anything against a book told entirely through text messages, especially because I think it's such a modern format and I think it's really funny, but I just felt like the way this was written was not representative of how teenagers would talk to each other. This book does not read like teenagers would text. I feel like this author needs to watch some more TikToks to do some research and then maybe retry. And the biggest part of this book that was a letdown, or I guess one of the multiple reasons why it wasn't let down, is because this book focuses so much on the main character's real like drama with her friend group, and it was so confusing because you only ever get the angle of the text messages they send, so you're not involved in the action and you don't see the fights that occur and the friendships and the conversations, and it's so difficult to comprehend because you're only getting like Sarah said this and then Stacy said this and then when I went to lunch with Rebecca said. So it was just difficult to hear the full story. I really wish I liked it. It was fun and fast to read, but it just was a mess. I could see it being a good book, but the way it was, it just did not do it well. So I gave this book 2 stars. And the next book I read was Tell Me How You Really Feel by Amina May Safi. So this is a YA contemporary book that's a enemies to lovers female-female romance. It is about these 2 girls. Once again, my internet's out, so I don't know their names. I think one of them is named Rachel. These 2 girls both go to the same school. One of them is like the super popular cheerleader. She's driven to go to college. The other girl is sort of the opposite. She wants to be a film student, so she's in like this film seminar and she's known as the school bitch. Like everyone agreed that that is just her type and she embraces that. Rachel's trying to finish her film project and the other girl gets roped into it, and so they have to work together on this project and they have to start hanging out together even though they hate each other, because back whenever the other girl first came to the school, she tried to ask Rachel out, but Rachel thought that she was like trying to pull a prank on her, so she rejected her in like this really uppity fashion, and ever since then there's been bad blood between the two, and they have to like grow past that and like learn that they had misconceptions about each other, and then like get closer as they're like filming this and editing it and they're hanging out more. It was so precious. I genuinely loved the 2 characters in this book. I think because they had such stark opposite personalities that the banter and the camaraderie between them was really interesting to read. One of the things that I wasn't a fan of though, and I should have known this, and maybe this is just a disclaimer, is I am not a huge fan of books that are about the film industry, so I think automatically it was a little bit slower paced for me just because it talked so much about the filming process of it and the storytelling within the film. So it wasn't just like this relationship between these 2 girls forming, it was very heavily based around Rachel like thinking about her movie and thinking about what to do and thinking about this. So I think there's equal parts romance and like the actual school project happening, which I should have expected, but I think I was hoping it would lean more toward ignoring the film part and just talking about the girls. That was a personal issue though. I also just felt like this book put together random scenes back to back, so there wasn't a whole ton of flow between them. This book's a dual perspective and I liked hearing from both the girls' perspectives, but it felt like there was no cohesion between one scene happening and the next scene happening. Still, it was a great enemies to lovers story. I ended up giving it 2.5 stars just because I did struggle with the pacing of it. I did end up having to skim some of it because, like I said, it jumped around with so many scenes that I felt were kind of irrelevant, talking so much about the project that I really wasn't interested in. I just wanted to see more of them hanging out together and more of them like working together instead of them like separately doing their own thing. Either way, love the characters. I feel like I've said that 20 times, so we're moving on. So the next book I read was Love at First Like by Hannah Orenstein. This is another adult romance. This follows a girl named Eliza who owns a jewelry company. When she's stalking her ex on her Instagram account for that company that she basically runs the social media for, she ends up seeing that her ex got engaged, and so in an emotional fit she makes this fake draft of her with a wedding ring on being like #blessed, I'm engaged, and instead of deleting deleting it, she ends up sending it. And so she goes to bed not realizing she'd accidentally sent it instead of deleting it, and wakes up and her page has exploded with publicity and congratulations. And people are reaching out to her to offer her free stuff, and they want to do promotion on her shop, and she realizes even though this engagement is fake, it's getting her a lot of business in a time that she desperately needs it. And so she rolls with it, and she's trying to find a fake fiance so that she can continue to have success for her company. This sounded like a cute concept. However, this book is the worst. The main character is a literal scammer who's a lying thief, and she's so mean and so rude. It would have been okay if this happened and it was an accident and she rolled with it and just like saw what came of it, but she would literally seek more opportunities to scam people into giving into it. Like, she would reach out to companies and be like, I'm engaged, do you want to do a story on me? Or like, hey, we want a honeymoon, do you want to give us a free honeymoon? And it was absurd. And that was paired also with the fact that she only had 100,000 followers. I feel like you wouldn't get a free venue, free dress, free honeymoon if you only had 100,000 followers. Like, that's Kylie Jenner level, you know what I mean? And then she ends up finding this guy that she is interested in and wants to be her fake fiance, but she doesn't tell him. And so the guy's name is Blake, and every time they hang out, like behind turned backs, she takes pictures of the thing they're doing together, and she's like faking that it's him that she's engaged to, and he doesn't even know he's being scammed and lied to. It's just completely unrealistic and so mean. The people who know that she's doing this don't even tell her not to do it. They're just like, good idea. Am I the only one that thinks this is super problematic to like ask for free stuff and like trick a guy into dating you so you can just have Facebook likes? It was absurd, and I hated it. And it was like a scam artist main character, and this would maybe be okay if it was like a literary fiction book about this girl doing this and then everyone finds out and it's this like humbling moment of, oh no, I did a bad thing. And this book does not end with everyone finding out she was lying and she has to suffer the consequences of it. It literally ends by her and her final love interest going on the free honeymoon, even though their engagement was never real. The main character just lies and steals and cheats her way into having a successful business and having likes on Instagram, and it was just so materialistic, and I hated the main character. I hated the love interest for supporting the main character. I hated her sister for allowing it to happen, the co-owner. I hated the main character's family for being like, you're so brave. I feel so bad for anyone who this main character conned in this book because it was miserable. I give it 1 star. This is not a romance, it's awful. Moving onward, because that book makes me infuriated. Like Jane Eyre, I had another book that I was kind of working on all year, and I finally finished Becoming by Michelle Obama, which is Michelle Obama's memoir about her life before the White House, her life during the White House, and her life adjusting after being the first lady. I am obsessed. I absolutely loved this. It was just really difficult to read because it was so long. Even though I listened to the audiobook, I would always put this down and then read a bunch of other stuff and then get back to it like a month later. So I read this in really chopped up segments, but once I got to the part where like she had met Obama and she was working in politics now and they were campaigning and they got to the White House, that's when it really picked up for me. So even though it took me a while to get into, I loved it. I honestly gave this 5 stars, and I have nothing negative to say in my review. I thought that she was so well spoken. I loved learning about her. Even though this book took me a long time to read, it did not hinder my experience whatsoever, which is typically not the case. So I think this book was powerful enough to still be a 5-star read, even though I read it so choppily and I read it in so many sittings, and it took me literally months to read this on audio. I was crying so hard listening to this. It just grabbed my emotions. 5 stars. Would love to read more by her. And then I read an arc of a book that I still cannot believe I got my hands on. I read Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This book is about a young woman named Alex who is recruited by Yale to go study at the school in order to be part of the Ninth House, which basically there's 8 houses at Yale, which are basically secret societies that use magic. And so this Ninth House was created to make sure that none of the other 8 houses are going beyond the rules and they're like not wreaking any havoc on campus or they're delving too deep into the magical world. She's just there to keep everyone in line, and she was selected because she has been able to see ghosts for as long as she can remember, and so she has this tap into the spiritual world that they think would be really valuable. So it's all about her on the Yale campus, and then this murder happens in the town and she has to decide, is this caused by the secret societies? How do we solve this? And amongst that is just growing turmoil with the spiritual people, I guess, in the town. So I'm gonna disclaim once again, I don't read mystery thriller very often, so this could be a me problem. I'm not saying don't buy and support Ninth House. I just had trouble with it because there is so much information in this book, and if you asked me to describe to you like what the 8 societies are, who were the characters, what is the magic system, what is the spiritual world, like there's so much of it that I don't think I could explain to you what happened in this book. It was very difficult to comprehend for me, and maybe it was because it was part thriller and part it was all like sort of paranormal. I just didn't really grasp it that well. Nothing really happens in this book. It's quite dry. The book just felt under-explained, and the mystery they were trying to solve felt like it was really low stakes. Particularly a big problem that I had with it is because she started at Yale in the fall when all college freshmen do, but this book takes place in the winter. So I feel like we could have gotten a much more organic introduction to this world if we see her go to the school, if we witness everyone explaining things to her about the world, and we witness her acquainting herself with everything while the reader is doing it as well, so we get a good grasp of the world as she's encountering it. But instead it's like we're fed bits and pieces of it as we go along because the story is trying to do this thing where it jumps back and forth in time and it reveals things, and there's information they're not telling us until the end of the book. And I thought that it was too much because there were so many different elements at play that being left in the dark just made it confusing. So that all sounds really negative, but if I'm being honest, it's Leigh Bardugo. It was written beautifully, even though it could be slow at times. The way that she describes things was really established well. I also really liked Alex's character, and especially the way that she interacted with the paranormal world, and all the paranormal elements that were in it were really cool, even if I didn't understand them all. This sets up for a sequel, which if you didn't know, there's going to be a sequel, and I think I'm going to enjoy the sequel a lot more, but it's going to be a totally different vibe, and I can see myself liking the sequel a lot more. So I gave it 2.5 stars. It's dark, it's interesting, but I feel like the synopsis makes it sound a lot better than it actually is because the story itself didn't really feel entirely there. I still think it's worth the read. It was still really impactful, and it does have a lot of great messaging about being a survivor of so many different things and the way that you can reinvent yourself and grow from that and gain power from it. The next book that I read is actually a duology, but I'll review them separately just because they're companion books. The first one was Prince Charming by Rachel Hawkins. The book's about Daisy. So Daisy's older sister Ellie gets engaged to a prince of Scotland, and so she's ripped up from her life and has to go over to Scotland. She used to be like a grocer in a grocery store. Now she's having to live and be amongst Scottish lords and ladies and royalty. The thing I like about this book is that Daisy is so sassy and witty and sarcastic, and the book is formatted in a way that every single chapter something new is happening. There's a twist at every single chapter. There's never a good place to put this book down just because so much is happening in succession. But at the same time, it also has a lot of realistic troubles folded into it that you wouldn't think would arise from like a royal romance that very few people are able to relate to. So there's lots of talking about like family and what it's like to have a sibling that outshines you. This is just the ultimate cute feel-good book, and I haven't read one of those in a long time. I think I probably should have read this book a couple of months earlier just to like lighten my spirits. If you need a book that's genuinely just a fun, quick, easy read that will make you smile and laugh out loud, this is your best friend. I gave it 4 stars. I highly recommend it. It's just such a fun series. And then if you read that one, you can read the spin-off novel, which I guess if you didn't want to read book 1, you could go ahead and read this by itself, even though I do recommend book 1 because it is so much fun. But this is kind of in the same vein with Scottish royalty. This follows a character named Millie who lives in Houston, so we love Texan girls. So this book follows Millie as she goes to Scotland to attend a boarding school. When she gets there, she realizes that her roommate is Princess flora of Scotland. They both are automatically very prickly toward each other, and so this book just follows how they're gonna have to be roommates the entire school year and all the different adventures they have to go on together at that school together, and the way that that sort of breaks down that tough exterior and how they get to know one another, and it just turns into a love story. This book is just iconic enemies to lovers. I thought it was so well done, so cute. It puts them in the perfect scenarios that's angsty and they pine for one another, but it's still like, but we can't be together. The only issue that I had with this is I felt like, especially compared to the first book where Daisy was so sarcastic and witty, it felt like a lot of characters in this book had the same kind of personality where they were sarcastic and witty and always trying to make a joke. And I wish that maybe one of the characters could have broken that with some tension or given us the opposite of that personality, just so that we're not reading the same line of dialogue over and over of them trying to be funny all the time. I loved this book. I gave this book 4.5 stars. It was such a fun book to read. They're so short and easy. Again, they're just the most ultimate feel-good books. If you want to fall in love with Scottish princess and princesses, you know where to go now. The next book I read was Lie With Me by Philip Besson. This is a very brief book about a man named Philip. I think it's like semi-autobiographical, but the main character is a writer and he is looking back on his life in his teenage years in the 80s, I think, 70s, 80s, when he had this whirlwind romance with a guy at a school. So it was this really secretive male-male relationship where they were both coming to terms with their sexualities. Again, at the time, it was like this taboo thing you couldn't talk about. So it was this really tentative, sensitive, almost shameful thing between them. And then it's kind of a 3-part book where it's the flashback to that told sort of in this retrospect perspective, which I love. It's my kryptonite. Just this mournful looking back on the past tone. And then it switches to when the main character is older and how he's remembering back on that after events have transpired that sort of reignite that memory in his head. And this book is infuriating because it is sad and it's tragic and it just rips me to pieces, but in the best way. And even though this book is translated from French, the way that this is written is, it's so simplistic and yet it packs so much meaning into the words. It's really easy and accessible to read, and yet it sticks with you and it's heavy. And even though you're only reading like a 5-word sentence, it has so much gravity to it. I have very little negative to say. It is infuriating to read and it got such a reaction out of me, and I'm so glad that I read it. The next book I read was an arc of a poetry book coming out that was called Aphrodite Made Me Do It by Tristan Mattier. This is going to be the first of many times I'm going to compare it to Milk and Honey, but I think it will stand up to that comparison. So it's like Milk and Honey where it has very short, simplistic poems, literal like one-liner poems at some point. So the book has poems that are all about like self-love and love. Obviously it's Aphrodite, so a lot of these poems are based on love and relationships. There's lots of poems about queerness and how Trista, I think she's bisexual, might be wrong on that, but she definitely vibes with other women. So it talks about the different types of love she experiences and abusiveness and just things that she has gone through. But then also those personal poems are sectioned off with like interspersions of poems that are from Aphrodite's point of view. And so it's these musings on how Aphrodite is misunderstood in culture and how she feels about love and how she has been misrepresented by the men who tell her stories. And I think it was a powerful collection because of the juxtaposition of those two, but also interspersed with all these poems. It was like reading an art journal because there are these artistic pages that it's not even just like drawings, it's like multimedia, like photographs with text on it, all these collages, and it's just beautiful. I really wish I had a copy of it to show you, but God knows I'm gonna be pre-ordering one because I really enjoyed it. I'm super excited about what she's done here. I think this poetry collection is groundbreaking and it's doing something different than a bunch of other ones that I've ever read. It has the writing style where it's short and easy to understand, but it still packs so much of a punch, which I think is rare for me to read poetry then have a lasting impression of it. So it definitely checked all the boxes that I typically look for in poetry. I highly recommend it when it comes out. So the next book I read was Ice Massacre by Tiana Warner, which is a female mermaid book. So this one follows Mila, who lives on an island where mermaids live within proximity of them, and they've always, for as long as they can remember, been sort of a threat to humanity. And so no one goes on the beaches, no one really takes ships out on the water anymore because they've all been attacked so frequently. And so to combat and sort of get revenge on these mermaids that have been so cruel to that island, every year the island does a massacre where these men will go out and try to kill as many as possible just to be threatening and assert their dominance. Every year those pretty much fail and no one comes back. So for the first year ever, they're going to put out an all-female mission to hopefully not be swayed by the mermaids, you know, siren influences and be able to defeat a lot of them and come back safe. So Mila is in the inaugural group of women who will go out on the ship and fight the mermaids. The twist is, whenever she was younger, Mila actually became friends with a mermaid in a tide pool by her house, and no one ever knew about it until one day her dad caught her and shot the mermaid, and that started bad blood and miscommunications between them. And so whenever she's on this mermaid ship, she basically gets reunited with that mermaid named Lissy, and the bad blood plays out. But it's an enemies to lovers, female-female romance feast. It's so wonderful. I absolutely devoured this book. I love the different character development of all the characters. For me, reading mermaid books is difficult, but this was so easy to comprehend. My only issue with it is that I didn't understand the purpose of massacres. There was really no nuance in the way that all the sailors and the people on the island saw the mermaids, because it was like, they attack people, they're bad. And I felt like there were so many plot holes with why they were being so malicious to one another, because this is set in current day. Like, this book mentions iCarly and Nickelodeon, so like it's set in the current day, and it's like, we're stuck on this island, we're getting poorer and poorer, we need to kill these mermaids. Why couldn't y'all get an airplane and like leave on an airplane instead of a boat so that you don't have to risk getting attacked? So there were just questions like that that were never really addressed, and I'm curious why, if it was such a problem, why couldn't they just take an airplane away and live somewhere else where they have access to food? So yeah, just parts of it like that confused me, and I wish that the author could have taken more time to develop the world building. But as far as the characters and the plot of being on a ship and tending to the wounded and having these literal daily fights of mermaids coming onto board to try and kill them, I think that that was really well done, and it was so action-packed. Again, I just stuck on those nagging questions of the world building and like, why did this book resort to violence when it seems like this whole thing was for nothing, kind of, I guess, in my head, because it felt so avoidable. Yeah, I'd like to read the sequel, but it's going to be interesting to see where it goes from here. So I gave that book, oh god, I didn't write it down. Let's say 4 stars. I think I gave it like 4 or 3.5. And then I read The Princess Diaries by Meg Cabot, which we all know The Princess Diaries. I feel like I don't need to give you a synopsis, but it follows Mia, who's just this average high school freshman dealing with a lot of problems, very whiny and very exasperated by life, when she finds out that she's actually a princess. So she's having to deal with this new identity, being afraid of people finding out and judging her for it because she's already sort of labeled as a dork. And this book was just so nostalgic. If you've seen the movie, you've basically read the book. This was published in 2000, and it has that sort of early 2000s vibe of a little bit silly. I can't even describe how it makes me feel, but like the sassiness of it and how over dramatic she is about everything was just so funny, and it just made me feel like I was 12 again, even though I was like 3 when the book was published. I loved the Princess Diaries movie, and it was such a fun read. I really have nothing else to say about it. I gave it 4 stars. I liked Mia. I liked the storyline. I actually would like to continue reading the books, because this one really only focused on her finding out about being a princess and wanting to hide it, and I think in future books it'll be her like embracing being a princess and like wanting to be royal. So I'm really interested to give those a read. It was just fun and nostalgic, and it was super short and easy. So if you haven't read those because you think they're going to be too juvenile, or like they didn't stand up the test of time, or they're going to be different than the movie, I think you should still give it a try, because it was buckets of fun, and I would not have read it had Sylvia from Wish Fulfillment not told me, hey, no, these are still good. So shout out to Sylvia for letting me know they were still good, and I'm gonna pass the plate on to you and say, if you've been interested but you thought that you might not like it, I still say it's worth a go. And the final book that I read was Summer of Salt by Katrina Leno, which is a YA contemporary book about this girl named Georgina who lives on an island with her twin sister and her mother that is famed for having this ancient bird visit every year. And this is kind of a multi-layered story, so stick with me. Basically, this family name has always had magic in their bloodlines, so the mother and her twin sister have magic, but she doesn't. And so she's grappling with a lot of different things this summer, like not having magic. Is she gonna get a power before she turns 18 at the end of the summer. She's also gonna go off to college at the end of the summer, which she's never left the island before, so it's a really big deal for her. And then on top of everything, for the first time ever, the bird that comes to their island every summer is missing. So it's this layered mystery and this angsty story about people coming to the island to find this bird. This one newcomer comes, who is the girl on the cover, and she's really drawn to her, so it's a female-female romance. And I would describe this book as a cross between Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children as far as like the magical abilities, and Second Chance Summer as far as like the family vibes and the beachy vibes. It was the perfect concoction of magical and contemporary. And I think even though it did have these really cute summery romance vibes, at the same time there's also really melancholy undertone. I know I keep saying melancholy, but you know it's my jam. The pining that the main character has for this new girl who comes on the island named Prue, I just think it was so sweet and so funny. The writing style in general in this book is really, really beautiful. As you can see, I have a library copy and I definitely want to pick this book up for myself one day. Also, as soon as I finished this, I looked up what other books Katrina Leno has written, and she's written like 4 others, so I'm gonna have to hop on those because I loved the writing of this one. So this was just a really interesting blend of a book. It was really dark and bizarre, but at the same time it was like a summer contemporary romance. I just liked how it had a ton of different things happening and yet it was still pretty concise. The only thing is, this book was really predictable, and I'm not saying that that's a negative thing because I still liked going on the journey of it, but the way that this unfolded, I very much saw it coming. And for this to be such like a magical book, I think the ending of it left me feeling like it was a little anticlimactic. I really don't know how to voice that without getting into spoilers, but I definitely want a sequel to this, even though I know that's not very likely to happen. It was just so much fun to read, and the way that it ended was so bittersweet, hopeful, yet still a bit sad. This is just my exact cup of tea, so I really, really enjoyed this book, and again, I can't wait to buy my own copy to have it on my shelf. That was all the books that I read over the summer. I read a lot of books I loved, a lot of books I didn't love. Let me know if you have read any of the books down below. Let's discuss. What was your favorite book of the summer? If you think that I would enjoy anything you've read recently based on my reviews of any of these, I'd love to hear them. I'm gonna respond to as many comments as I can because I know I've been gone for so long and I owe y'all video after video and comment after comment, so I'm gonna be as engaged as I can be for as long as I can be. Thank you for sticking around. I'm gonna try and hold these all up for a thumbnail now, but you'll be seeing more of me. Reading vlogs are coming back. I have like unposted videos that I did while I was gone, so those will be sprinkled in, and yeah, I will for sure see you next time. Goodbye.